Hello, welcome back for the final installment of our book club. We're going to finish this book up today, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that you're excited for the last part. If you've been following along with the I guess study guide book club question and answer in the linked in the comments there. Hope you're getting good summaries, good predictions. Even if your predictions aren't coming true, that's okay. The whole idea is that you're thinking about the story and thinking about what might happen, and those predictions don't have to be correct for that to become an effective reading strategy. So, without further ado, we'll finish this up. This is a little bit longer amount of pages here, so I will get started. Chapter 13. Strong arms lifted George up. He felt himself being carried. "Papa," he said. "Papa? Why does his head hurt so much? Had the panther knocked him out of the tree? Was he sick with fever like Mama? And whose voice was whispering in his ear? Giorgio, Giorgio, wake up!" George opened his eyes. Marco's amber eyes shone down on him. This was no dream. He was not sick. The Titanic was sinking. The bow was completely underwater now, and waves swept over the dock. Lounge chairs sailed past them and crashed over the side. People clung to the rails. A few slipped and were swept overboard. Marco had wrapped one arm around the railing and another around George. "It's time to go," Marco said. "Go where?" George said, even though he knew. They were going into the water. There was nowhere else for them to go. Marco held George's arm as they climbed over the railing. "When we jump, jump as far as you can, away from the ship." George filled his lungs with icy air. "Jump!" Marco cried. George pushed with his feet and leaped off the boat. He closed his eyes, imagining that he had enormous wings and that he would take him soaring into the sky. But then he hit the water, and down he went. And just when he was sure his lungs would pop, the ocean seemed to spit him back up. George sputtered. The water was so cold, it felt like millions of needles were stabbing him. It hurt so much he couldn't move. Someone grabbed him by the life jacket and started dragging him away from the ship. It took George a few seconds to realize that it was Marco. He stopped to grab a door that was floating by. After helping George climb up on top, Marco found a crate for himself. It wasn't big enough to keep his feet out of the water, but it was better than nothing. The crate had a rope attached to it. Marco tied it around his arm and handed the end to George. "Hold tight," he said. They turned and stared at the ship. The entire front was underwater, and the back had risen toward the sky. It groaned and squeaked and sparked. Kind of like how the picture on the front looks. Black smoke poured from its funnels, and the lights flickered. It was like watching a fairy tale dragon, stabbed and bleeding, fighting for its life. And finally, it seemed to give up. The groaning stopped. The lights went dark, and the Titanic sank into the bubbling black water, down, 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 until George closed his eyes. He couldn't make himself watch Mr. Andrews' beautiful ship disappear. A sound rose around him. People calling for help. More and more people screaming and yelling, hundreds of voices, swirling together like a howling wind. Marco pulled George away from the people in the wreckage. George couldn't believe how strong he was, how hard he kicked, how his arms sliced through the water. And when he finally stopped, Marco was gasping for breath, exhaling clouds of white mist. He tightened the rope around his arm and patted George on the shoulder. "I rest now, Giorgio," he said breathlessly. He closed his eyes and put his head down on the crate. Soon. Soon what? George was afraid to ask. Soon it would be over? Soon they would be rescued? Or soon they would be swallowed up by the darkness? George heard men talking somewhere close by. He looked around, relieved that he wasn't all by himself, and to his shock, just ahead, he saw a lifeboat. "Marco, wake up!" But Marco didn't move. His arms hung off the side of the crate. His feet dangled in the icy water. And here are some pictures of what they did, jumping off the boat, finding the door in the crate, and then paddling. "Marco, we need to get to that boat." But Marco was still, and George realized that his friend had used every last ounce of strength. He'd gotten George off the sinking ship and across the icy waters. It was up to George now. He tucked the rope under his body and started paddling. The water seared his hands and arms. It was so cold it felt boiling hot, like lava. But he didn't stop until he reached the boat. It wasn't a regular wooden lifeboat. It was much smaller and made of a canvas cloth. There were about 10 people crowded inside, mostly men. And they all seemed dazed and frozen. Nobody spoke as George paddled up and grabbed hold of the side. But somebody pushed his hand off. "Get back," a voice said weakly. "You'll pull us all in the water." "Please," said George. "We need help." George put his hand up again, but again someone pushed it off. And so George pulled Marco to the other side of the boat. He tried again. Nobody helped him, but this time nobody stopped him. It took 3 tries, but he managed to hoist himself over the side and tumble into the boat. And now for Marco. He got up on his knees and leaned over, bracing his legs against the side of the boat as he grabbed Marco under the arms. He pulled, but Marco was attached to the crate by the rope. He tried again, yanking the rope, digging at the knot with his frozen fingers, but the knot was like rusted metal. George struggled and water sloshed over the side of the boat. "Just let him go," one of the men said weakly. "It's hopeless." But George kept working on the rope, trying now to break it away from the crate. He was pulling so hard that at first he didn't notice that Marco was slipping into the sea. "Please, somebody," George screamed. "Can't you help us?" A woman from the front of the boat climbed back to George. She wore a black coat, her head and face hidden by a flowered shawl. As she pushed George aside, she pulled something out of her coat, a knife. With a clean cut, she sliced the rope and helped George pull Marco into the boat. Her hands looked surprisingly strong. George fell back, exhausted. "Thank you," George said to the woman through chattering teeth. The woman didn't say anything, and suddenly George noticed the knife, a Bowie knife with an elk horn handle. George looked up under the shawl. 2 glittering blue eyes looked back at him. The scar-faced man. He had saved Marco's life. Without a word, he handed George his knife, and then he looked away. Chapter 14. The cold pressed down on George until it seemed to crush his bones. He huddled close to Marco, trying to keep them both warm. Marco barely moved. Some of the men sang softly, others prayed, some made no sounds at all. Hours went by. The sea became rougher, and every few minutes a wave splashed into the boat. George was drifting off to sleep when one of the men shouted, "It's a ship!" And sure enough, a bright light was heading toward them. "No," another man said, "it's just lightning." But the light was getting bigger and brighter. George stared at that light, and afraid if he even blinked it would disappear. But soon he could see the outline of a gigantic ship steaming toward them. He whispered to Marco, who barely fluttered his eyes. He pulled his friend closer, rubbing his arms. "It won't be long," he whispered. "Hang on." As the sky brightened, George gaped at the scene around him. It was as if they'd fallen through a hole in the ocean and come out on the other side of the earth. There were icebergs all around them, hundreds of them, as far as George could see. They sparkled in the golden light. They were so beautiful, but looking at them sent a chill up George's spine. As the ship got closer, George could see that it was a passenger steamer, like the Titanic. Closer and closer it came until George could read its name, Carpathia. Here's a picture. There were people crowded on the deck, looking over the rail. They were yelling and shouting and waving, but one voice rose above all the others like a siren. "Papa! Papa! Giorgio!" Marco's eyes fluttered and he smiled a little. "Enzo," he whispered. George could see the little boy, waving frantically from Aunt Daisy's arms. Phoebe stood next to them, waving with the sunlight glinting off her spectacles. "They're safe, Marco," George said. "They made it." And George grabbed Marco's hand, and so did we. Chapter 15. Final chapter. Those first 2 days on the Carpathia were a blur. George mostly slept on a bed of blankets and pillows on the floor of the first-class lounge, but he sensed that Phoebe and Aunt Daisy never left his side. He sometimes heard Enzo singing softly to him in Italian, his breath hot on George's cheek. He heard Aunt Daisy and Phoebe talking about Marco, whose feet were badly frozen, about the Carpathia's passengers who couldn't do enough for them all, about the hundreds and hundreds of people who didn't make it out of the water. Slowly, George felt stronger, and on their last night at sea, he was able to go out onto the deck with Phoebe. They sat on a bench wrapped in a blanket. A stewardess came over and gave them each a mug of warm milk. Phoebe looked up at the sky as she warmed her hands on her mug. "I finally saw a shooting star when I was on the lifeboat." You can guess what I wished for. Phoebe said that only about 700 of them made it out of the water. Phoebe leaned in close to George. Her coat smelled like rose water. A lady from the Carpathia had given it to her. "Have you wondered if maybe there really was a curse?" At first, George didn't understand that Phoebe was talking about the mummy. With all that had happened, George hadn't thought about it. But now it hit him. How strange it was that the ship had collided with an iceberg at the exact moment the scar-faced man had opened the lid of Mr. Burrow's crate. "Guess we'll never know," George said. But the next evening, as the Carpathia was closing in on New York Harbor, George and Phoebe overheard a skinny man with a beard speaking to an officer. Before the Titanic, I was traveling in Egypt, a place called Thebes, the man said. I explored a magnificent tomb of a royal family. Phoebe's eyes bugged out, and before George could stop her, she marched over to the man. Excuse me, she said. Are you Mr. Burroughs? Yes, I am, the man replied. Phoebe took a big breath. Mr. Burroughs, this might sound like a very strange question, but did you bring a mummy on board the Titanic? The man looked at Phoebe. A mummy, he said. Yes, we heard it was a princess. Mr. Burroughs' eyes were tired and sad, but he smiled a little. My princess, yes. So there was a mummy? Phoebe exclaimed. No, child, one should never take a mummy from a tomb. That is very bad luck. Princess was my cat. She passed away on my trip to Egypt, so I had her wrapped so I could bring her back with me. So the princess was a cat? Yes, he said sadly, the most beautiful cat that ever lived. 3 hours later, just after 9 o'clock, the Carpathia docked in New York City in a thunderstorm. There were thousands of people waiting on the pier, but the first person George saw as they walked down the gangplank was Papa. He rushed to George and Phoebe, grabbing them both and pulling them to him. All around them, people cried with happiness. Others just cried, their tears mixing with the pouring rain. They introduced Papa to Marco and Enzo, but there wasn't much time to talk. Their train to Millerstown was leaving soon, and an ambulance was waiting to take Marco to the hospital. Luckily, George didn't have to say a real goodbye to Marco and Enzo. Aunt Daisy was staying in New York City to take care of Enzo until Marco's feet were healed, and then they would come with her for a visit to Millerstown. Seeing the way Marco and Aunt Daisy were looking at each other, George wondered if maybe Marco and Enzo would stay forever. George sure hoped so. As they rode to the train station, newsboys screamed from every corner, "Read all about it! Titanic survivors in New York! Read all about it!" George covered his ears. He wanted to forget everything about the Titanic. He wanted to put it out of his mind forever. But he couldn't forget. Even back on the farm, surrounded by friends from school and neighbors from town, he felt like he was still drifting in the dark ocean. And each day that went by, he felt himself drifting farther away. At night, when he got into bed, he'd see the faces of those scared people on G-deck. He'd see the ship disappearing into the sea. He'd remember the stabbing cold and the screams of hundreds of people crying for help. He didn't bother trying to fall asleep. Each night, after Phoebe and Papa were in bed, he went out into the woods. He was heading back to the house one night when he heard a noise through the bushes. Something was there. He could sense it. The panther? He took out his knife, fighting the urge to run away, and peered through the branches. George stared in shock. It was Papa. He was sitting on a large rock, looking up at the sky, smoking his pipe. He looked like he'd been there for some time. Papa turned. He didn't look especially surprised to see George. "Sorry to give you a scare," he said. "What are you doing here?" George asked. "Don't know," Papa said. "Sometimes I just come here when I can't sleep." George couldn't believe it. How many nights had they both been out in the woods at the same time? Papa eased himself off the rock and began walking back toward the house. "I'll take you up to your bed." "No, Papa," George said. "I come to the woods too." Papa looked at him with a very slight smile. "I know that," he said. Papa knew? What else did Papa know about George? What else didn't George know about Papa? He and his father looked at each other, really looked for the first time in a long while. Suddenly, George started to cry. They took him by surprise, his tears. He couldn't stop. He cried for all those people who didn't make it out of the water. He cried because somehow he did. He cried because he knew that no matter how much time went by, a part of him would still be out in that ocean. He would never forget. Papa held George's hand and didn't say a word, and then he led George over to the boulder, where they sat together under the stars. George stared up at the sky. Were those really the same stars that had burned so brightly above the black ocean that night? Was he really the same boy? George, who couldn't stay out of trouble. George, who didn't try hard at school. George, who found escape ladders. George, who pulled Marco to that lifeboat. Who didn't give up. They sat on the boulder for a long while, and as the sun started to peep over the trees, George told Papa about Mr. Andrews. He said he thought one day I'd build a ship. Papa didn't laugh. He looked thoughtful. "How about we build one together," Papa said. "A nice little boat for the pond. I've always wanted to do that." "That's a good idea," George said. "A great idea." "We could start today," Papa said, standing up and holding out his hand. They walked back to the house together. The birds were singing softly. The chickens were squawking for breakfast. A breeze was whispering through the trees, and a voice seemed to sing to George very softly. "Awake, awake, it's now daybreak, but don't forget your dreams." Papa looked out into the woods like he could hear it too. So that's the end of our story. Thank you for following along with me, and I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed Hope you learned a little about history too on the way, and I will look forward to seeing any questions you have, responses you have to summaries or predictions. And again, I hope everybody's well, and I look forward to talking to you in the future.